In the ancient fields of Bethlehem, a foreign widow made a choice that would echo through eternity. Ruth, a Moabite woman with no claim to Israel's promises, walked away from everything she knew to follow her mother-in-law into an uncertain future. Little did she know that her act of loyalty would place her name in the most important genealogy in human history. How did a poor outsider from a despised nation become the great-grandmother of King David and an ancestor of Jesus Christ himself? This is the extraordinary story of Ruth, where divine providence turned tragedy into triumph and a humble gleaner became royalty in God's eternal plan. The story begins in a time when Israel had no king and judges ruled the land. It was a difficult period, full of chaos and uncertainty. During these troubled days, something terrible happened in Bethlehem. The book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1, tells us that there was a famine in the land. Now you need to understand something important here. Bethlehem's name literally means house of bread. Can you imagine that? The house of bread had no bread. The irony was almost cruel. A man named Elimelech lived in Bethlehem with his wife Naomi and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They were a family from the tribe of Judah, part of God's chosen people. But as the famine grew worse and worse, Elimelech faced an impossible choice. Should he stay and watch his family starve, or should he leave the promised land to find food elsewhere? According to Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1, Elimelech made his decision. He took his wife and his two sons and went to live for a while in the country of Moab. This wasn't just a simple move to the next town. Moab was across the Jordan River, east of the Dead Sea. It was a foreign nation with foreign gods. The Moabites were descendants of Lot through an inappropriate relationship with his daughter, and the Israelites had a complicated history with them. God had even given specific instructions about the Moabites in Deuteronomy. But hunger has a way of making people do things they never thought they would do. Elimelech packed up his entire family and left the land that God had given to his ancestors. What started as a temporary solution became something much longer. Ruth chapter 1 verse 2 gives us their names clearly. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. When they arrived in Moab, they settled there. The word settled is important. They didn't just pass through. They made Moab their new home, built a life there, and became part of that foreign community. Life in Moab seemed to go on normally for a while. The family had escaped the famine and found stability in this foreign land. But then tragedy struck in a way that no one could have predicted. Ruth chapter 1 verse 3 tells us what happened next. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Just like that, the man who had made the bold decision to move his family to Moab was gone. Naomi found herself a widow in a foreign country, far from her relatives and her people. But Naomi still had her two sons. They were her hope, her future, her security. In that culture, sons meant everything to a widow. They would take care of her, provide for her, and continue the family name. The young men grew up in Moab, and as Ruth chapter 1 verse 4 explains, they married Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. This was another significant step away from their Hebrew roots. Their father had moved them to Moab, and now they were marrying Moabite women, fully integrating into this foreign society. For about 10 years, they all lived together in Moab. Can you picture it? Naomi, with her two daughters-in-law, building relationships, sharing meals, learning each other's ways. Ruth and Orpah became true daughters to Naomi, not just by law, but by love. They created a family bond that went beyond culture and nationality. These were good years, stable years, years where Naomi could catch her breath after losing her husband. But then the unthinkable happened. Ruth, chapter 1 verse 5, records the devastating news. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband, both sons, gone dead. The text doesn't tell us how they died or why. It doesn't give us the details of their illnesses or accidents. It simply states the crushing reality. Naomi had now lost everything. Her husband was dead. Both her sons were dead. She had no grandchildren to carry on the family name, no sons to provide for her, no security, no future. In the ancient world, this was the worst possible situation for a woman. Naomi was now a childless widow in a foreign land. She had no inheritance rights, no income, no protection. And to make matters even more complicated, her 2 daughters-in-law were now in the same terrible position. 3 widows, all without children, all without men to provide for them. The family that had come to Moab seeking relief from famine had instead found something far worse, complete devastation. Time passed, and Naomi lived in her grief and uncertainty in Moab. But then something changed. News travels, even across borders and between nations. Word reached Moab about what was happening back in Judah, back in Bethlehem, back in the land Naomi had left so many years ago. Ruth chapter 1 verse 6 tells us exactly what she heard. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Let those words sink in. The Lord had visited his people. The famine was over. God had provided food again in Bethlehem. The house of bread had bread once more. For Naomi, this news must have stirred something deep inside her heart. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was simply the realization that she had nothing left to lose. Perhaps it was a longing for home, for her people, for the land of her youth. Whatever the reason, Naomi made a decision. She would return to Judah. This wasn't an easy choice. Naomi had lived in Moab for more than 10 years. She had buried her husband there. She had buried both her sons there. Everything familiar to her in recent memory was in Moab. But sometimes going back is the only way forward. Sometimes you have to return to where you started to find your way again. Ruth chapter 1 verse 7 describes what happened next. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Picture this scene. 3 widows walking together on the dusty road leading out of Moab. Naomi in the middle, probably older now, worn down by grief and hardship. On either side of her, Ruth and Orpah, younger women who had loved their husbands and now loved their mother-in-law enough to leave their own country with her. They were heading toward an uncertain future in a foreign land. For Naomi, it was a return home. But for Ruth and Orpah, it would be stepping into the unknown, leaving behind everything they had ever known. The journey from Moab to Bethlehem would take several days of walking. It was a significant distance, and the road was not always safe. But these 3 women set out together, united in their loss and their loyalty to one another. They had shared grief. They had shared tears. Now they would share this journey, whatever it might bring. As they walked along the road, Naomi began to think about what she was doing. She was leading these 2 young Moabite women away from their homeland, away from any chance they might have of rebuilding their lives. The more she thought about it, the more troubled she became. What kind of future could she offer them in Judah? She had nothing. No land, no money, no sons for them to marry. She was returning to Bethlehem as a poor, broken widow. Why should Ruth and Orpah suffer because of her losses? Ruth chapter 1 verse 8 tells us that Naomi stopped on the road and said to both her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Notice what Naomi said. She told them to go back to their mother's houses, not their father's houses. This suggests that perhaps their fathers had died, or perhaps this was simply acknowledging that their mothers would be their main source of comfort and support. She blessed them, asking the Lord to be kind to them, just as they had been kind to her and to her dead sons. Naomi continued in Ruth chapter 1 verse 9, "The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." This was Naomi's deepest wish for them. In that culture, a woman's security and rest came through marriage. Naomi wanted Ruth and Orpah to find new husbands, to have the chance at normal lives, to have children and homes of their own. She knew that in Bethlehem, as foreign women, their chances of remarrying would be slim to none. But here in Moab, among their own people, they still had hope. Then Naomi did something that showed the depth of her love for these young women. The text says she kissed them. It was a kiss of goodbye, a kiss of blessing, a kiss of release. And when she kissed them, all three women broke down. Ruth chapter 1 verse 9 tells us they lifted up their voices and wept. Can you hear their crying on that dusty road? Three women who had become family through marriage, now facing the pain of separation on top of all the grief they already carried. The daughters-in-law didn't want to leave Naomi. Ruth chapter 1 verse 10 records their response. They said to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." They weren't just being polite. They meant it. They wanted to stay with Naomi, to go with her wherever she went, to become part of her people. They loved her that much. The bonds they had formed over those 10 years in Moab were real and deep. But Naomi wouldn't accept their first answer. She pressed them harder, speaking with the brutal honesty that comes from deep pain. Ruth chapter 1 verses 11 and 12 record her words. "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Naomi was referring to an ancient custom called levirate marriage, where if a man died without children, his brother was supposed to marry the widow and provide an heir. But Naomi had no more sons. She couldn't have more sons. She was too old to remarry and have children. Even if she could, would Ruth and Orpah really wait 15 or 20 years for those sons to grow up? The whole idea was absurd, and Naomi knew it. She was trying to make them see reality clearly. She had nothing to offer them except hardship and poverty. Notice something important in Naomi's words. She said, "The hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Naomi believed that God himself was behind her suffering. She felt that the Lord had turned against her, that she was under some kind of divine judgment. This wasn't just bad luck or random tragedy. In her mind, God had specifically targeted her for pain. This gives us a window into her emotional and spiritual state. She was bitter, broken, and felt abandoned by God. Once again, the three women wept together. The emotion of this moment was overwhelming. They cried loudly on that road between Moab and Judah, torn between love and practical wisdom, between loyalty and survival. And then something shifted. Ruth chapter 1 verse 14 tells us what happened. "Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." Orpah made her choice. She kissed Naomi goodbye and turned back toward Moab, toward her mother's house, toward the possibility of a new husband and a new life. The text doesn't condemn Orpah for this decision. She had already shown tremendous loyalty by coming this far. She had loved her husband and honored her mother-in-law. Now she was simply being practical, taking Naomi's advice, choosing the path that made the most sense. She walked back down the road toward her homeland, and that's the last we ever hear of her. But Ruth clung to Naomi. The Hebrew word used here is powerful. It's the same word used in Genesis when it says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife." It speaks of an unbreakable bond, a fierce determination to stay attached no matter what. Ruth grabbed onto Naomi and wouldn't let go, even as her sister-in-law walked away, even as the sensible choice was staring her in the face. Naomi saw what was happening and made one more attempt. Ruth chapter 1, verse 15 records her words. "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." This was Naomi's final argument. She pointed out that Orpah had gone back not just to her people, but to her gods. The Moabites worshipped Chemosh and other deities. If Ruth went to Judah, she would be leaving behind the gods of her childhood, the religion of her people, everything familiar about her spiritual life. Was she really ready for that? What happened next is one of the most beautiful moments in all of Scripture. Ruth chapter 1 verses 16 and 17 give us Ruth's response, and it's absolutely stunning. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." Read those words again slowly. This wasn't just a nice sentiment. This was a total life commitment. Ruth was pledging herself to Naomi in the most complete way possible. She was choosing Naomi's path as her path, Naomi's people as her people, and most importantly, Naomi's God as her God. She was converting, not just culturally, but spiritually. She was leaving behind the gods of Moab and embracing the Lord, the God of Israel. And she was making this choice knowing that it meant poverty, uncertainty, and life as a foreigner in a strange land. Ruth even invoked the name of the Lord in her oath. "The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." She was calling on Naomi's God to punish her if she ever broke this promise. Only death itself would be allowed to separate them. This was as serious and binding as any vow could be. Ruth wasn't just being emotional or impulsive. She was making a conscious, deliberate, irrevocable choice to tie her destiny to Naomi's, no matter what the cost. What motivated Ruth to make such an extreme commitment? The text doesn't tell us directly, but we can see several things. She clearly loved Naomi deeply. She had seen something in Naomi's character and in the God that Naomi served that drew her in. Perhaps during those 10 years of living together, Naomi had taught her about the Lord, about his faithfulness, about his covenant with Israel. Perhaps Ruth had seen in Naomi's life, even in her grief, a quality of faith that was worth following. Whatever the reason, Ruth was all in. After Ruth's powerful declaration, Naomi finally stopped arguing. Ruth, chapter 1, verse 18 tells us simply, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Naomi recognized that Ruth's mind was made up. There was no point in continuing to try to convince her. So the two women continued their journey together. Where there had been 3, now there were 2. An older Hebrew widow and a young Moabite widow, walking side by side toward an uncertain future. They traveled on, covering the miles day by day, until finally they reached their destination. Ruth chapter 1 verse 19 says, "Now the 2 of them went until they came to Bethlehem." After all those years away, after all that had happened, Naomi was home. But this wasn't a quiet, unnoticed return. The text continues, "And it happened, when they had come to Bethlehem, that all the city was excited because of them, and the women said, 'Is this Naomi?'" Think about what this means. The whole town was stirred up when they arrived. People came out to see what was happening. The women of Bethlehem, who had known Naomi years before, could hardly believe their eyes. "Is this Naomi?" they asked. They almost didn't recognize her. The woman who had left Bethlehem with her husband and 2 sons had returned alone, except for a foreign daughter-in-law. The years of grief and hardship had clearly changed her appearance. She looked different. She seemed different. And Naomi confirmed that she was indeed different. Ruth chapter 1 verse 20 records her response to the women. But she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." The name Naomi means pleasant. The name Mara means bitter. Naomi was essentially saying, "Don't call me pleasant anymore, call me bitter. That's what I am now. That's what God has made me." She was completely honest about her pain and her feeling that God had treated her harshly. She continued in Ruth chapter 1 verse 21. "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Here was Naomi's view of her own story. She had left Bethlehem full, with a husband and 2 sons, with hope and a future. Now she was returning empty, with nothing. She blamed God directly. She said the Lord had testified against her, that the Almighty had brought affliction upon her. In her eyes, God was responsible for her suffering. But here's something Naomi couldn't see in that moment. She said she was returning empty, but that wasn't entirely true. Yes, she had lost her husband and sons. Yes, she was poor and widowed, but she wasn't empty. She had Ruth. Standing right beside her was a young woman who had given up everything to follow her, who had pledged total loyalty, who had chosen Naomi's God as her own God. Naomi felt empty, but God's provision was already at work in ways she couldn't yet understand. Ruth, chapter 1, verse 22, wraps up this first part of the story. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Notice several important details here. The text specifically identifies Ruth as the Moabitess. Her foreign status is emphasized. This will be important as the story continues. She's not just Ruth, she's Ruth the Moabite, an outsider, a foreigner in Israel. And notice the timing. They arrived at the beginning of barley harvest. This wasn't random or accidental. The barley harvest in Bethlehem happened in late April or early May. It was a time of plenty, a time when the fields were full and workers were needed. This timing would prove to be crucial for what was about to happen. God's providence was already at work, arranging circumstances and timing events in ways that would soon become clear. Naomi and Ruth had arrived home. The first chapter had closed with loss and bitterness, but something new was beginning. Now that Naomi and Ruth were back in Bethlehem, they faced a serious problem. They had no money, no food, and no way to support themselves. 2 widows living alone needed to figure out how to survive. Ruth saw the situation clearly and decided to do something about it. Ruth chapter 2 verse 2 records what she said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor." You need to understand what gleaning meant. God had given a special law to Israel about harvesting. When farmers cut down their grain, they weren't allowed to go back and pick up every single stalk that fell. They had to leave some behind for the poor, the widows, and the foreigners. This was God's welfare system, his way of caring for people who had nothing. So Ruth was basically saying, "Let me go follow behind the harvesters and pick up whatever they leave behind. Maybe someone will be kind enough to let me do this." Naomi agreed to Ruth's plan. She simply said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth got up early and went out to the fields. Now here's where something remarkable happens. Ruth chapter 2 verse 3 tells us, "Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech." Did you catch that phrase? She happened to come. The text makes it sound random, like Ruth just accidentally ended up in this particular field. But was it really an accident? Ruth didn't know whose field she was entering. She was new to Bethlehem, a foreigner who didn't know the layout of the land or who owned what. She just picked a field and started working. But this field belonged to Boaz, and Boaz was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband. What looks like chance was actually God's invisible hand, guiding Ruth's steps to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The text identifies Boaz as someone from the family of Elimelech, but it also gives us another important detail. Ruth chapter 2 verse 1, which introduces Boaz before Ruth even goes to the field, says, "There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz." This man wasn't just any relative. He was wealthy, he was established, and he was connected to Naomi's family line. Everything was being set in place, though Ruth had no idea what was about to unfold. Ruth worked hard in the field, bending down again and again to pick up the grain that the harvesters had left behind. It was backbreaking work under the hot sun, but she kept at it. While she was working, something happened. The owner of the field showed up. Ruth chapter 2 verse 4 tells us, "Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered him, 'The Lord bless you.'" Notice how Boaz greeted his workers. He blessed them in the name of the Lord. This wasn't just a casual hello. This showed the kind of man Boaz was. He was a man of faith who honored God in his daily business. He treated his workers with respect and spoke blessings over them. They responded in kind, showing that there was mutual respect between this landowner and his employees. Boaz looked around his field and noticed someone he didn't recognize. There was a young woman gleaning among his workers, someone he had never seen before. Ruth chapter 2 verse 5 records his question to the servant who was in charge of the reapers. "Whose young woman is this?" He wanted to know who she was, where she came from, who she belonged to. In that culture, women were usually identified by their relationship to a man, either a father or a husband. The servant answered him, and his response is recorded in Ruth chapter 2 verses 6 and 7. It is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. The servant told Boaz several important things. First, this was the Moabite woman who had come with Naomi. Second, she had asked permission politely before gleaning. Third, she had been working non-stop since morning, barely taking a break. Boaz was impressed. Here was a foreign woman, a Moabite, who had shown incredible loyalty by coming to Bethlehem with Naomi. And now she was out in the fields working hard to provide for both of them. Boaz did something unexpected. He walked right up to Ruth and spoke directly to her. Ruth chapter 2 verse 8 records his words, "You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women." Think about what Boaz just did. He called her my daughter, showing kindness and respect. He told her not to go to any other field, but to stay in his field. He gave her permission to stay close to his young women workers, which would provide her with protection and companionship. This was extraordinary generosity. Boaz didn't have to do any of this. Ruth was a foreigner with no claim on his kindness. But Boaz saw beyond her nationality and recognized her character. Boaz continued speaking in Ruth chapter 2 verse 9. "Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Now Boaz was going even further. He commanded his young men not to bother her or harass her. This was crucial protection. A foreign woman alone in the fields could easily be taken advantage of or abused. Boaz made it clear that Ruth was under his protection. He even told her to drink from the water his servants had drawn, treating her not as an outsider, but as one of his own workers. Ruth was overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. Ruth chapter 2 verse 10 describes her reaction. So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Ruth bowed all the way to the ground, a sign of deep respect and gratitude. She couldn't understand why this important man was being so kind to her. She was a foreigner, a Moabite, someone who should have been ignored or even rejected. Why was he taking notice of her? Boaz answered her question. Ruth chapter 2 verses 11 and 12 record his response. "It has been fully reported to me, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Boaz had heard all about Ruth. The news of what she had done for Naomi had spread throughout Bethlehem. Everyone was talking about the Moabite woman who had given up everything to stay with her mother-in-law. Boaz knew that Ruth had left her own parents, her own country, her own gods, and had come to Israel to take refuge under the wings of the Lord. He prayed that God would reward her fully for her loyalty and her faith. This was more than just polite words. Boaz recognized that Ruth had made a spiritual journey as significant as a physical one. Ruth responded with humility and gratitude. Ruth chapter 2 verse 13 captures her words. "Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." Ruth acknowledged that she wasn't even on the same level as Boaz's servants. She was lower than them in social standing, yet he had spoken kindly to her and comforted her heart. His words had given her hope and encouragement in a situation where she felt completely vulnerable. As the day wore on and lunchtime approached, Boaz did something else that showed his generous heart. Ruth chapter 2 verse 14 tells us what happened. "Now Boaz said to her at mealtime, 'Come here and eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar.' So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied and kept some back." Boaz invited Ruth to eat with him and his workers. This wasn't something he had to do. Gleaners weren't normally included in the workers' meals. But Boaz welcomed her, offered her bread and vinegar to dip it in, and even personally handed her parched grain. Ruth ate until she was full, and she had so much that she was able to save some to take home to Naomi. This detail is important because it shows that Boaz wasn't just being barely polite, he was being abundantly generous. After the meal, when Ruth got up to continue gleaning, Boaz gave special instructions to his workers. Ruth chapter 2 verse 15 records his command, "And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her.'" Normally, gleaners had to stay behind the harvesters and only pick up what was dropped. But Boaz told his men to let Ruth glean right among the sheaves themselves, among the bundles of grain that had already been gathered. This would make her work much easier and much more productive. But Boaz went even further. Ruth chapter 2 verse 16 gives us his additional instructions. "Also, let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." Boaz was telling his workers to deliberately drop extra grain for Ruth to find. They were supposed to accidentally leave handfuls of grain in her path. This was extraordinary kindness. Boaz was making sure that Ruth would have plenty to take home, far more than an ordinary gleaner would gather. So Ruth continued working in the field until evening. When the day was done, she threshed out what she had gathered, separating the grain from the husks. Ruth chapter 2 verse 17 tells us the result. "So she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley." An ephah was a large amount, probably about 30 pounds of grain. This was far more than a gleaner would normally collect in a day. Thanks to Boaz's kindness and his workers' obedience to his instructions, Ruth had gathered enough barley to feed herself and Naomi for days. Ruth picked up her heavy load and carried it back into the city. When she arrived home, Naomi must have been shocked. Ruth chapter 2 verse 18 describes the scene. Then she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. Ruth showed Naomi the huge amount of barley she had gathered. Then she pulled out the extra food she had saved from lunch and gave it to Naomi. Naomi could see immediately that something unusual had happened. This was too much grain for a normal day of gleaning. Naomi asked Ruth about her day. Ruth chapter 2 verse 19 records her questions. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where have you gleaned today, and where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." Naomi wanted to know everything. Where had Ruth been? Who had allowed her to gather so much? And when Ruth told her the man's name was Boaz, everything changed. The moment Naomi heard the name Boaz, she understood what was happening. Her whole attitude shifted. The bitter woman who had come back to Bethlehem feeling empty suddenly saw a glimmer of hope. Ruth chapter 2 verse 20 captures Naomi's excited response. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead." And Naomi said to her, "This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives." Naomi blessed Boaz in the name of the Lord. She recognized that God had not abandoned them after all. The Lord was showing kindness both to the living, meaning herself and Ruth, and to the dead, meaning her husband and sons, whose family line could potentially be continued. Then she explained something crucial to Ruth. Boaz wasn't just a random kind person. He was a relative, specifically one of their close relatives. The Hebrew word used here is goel, which means a kinsman redeemer. This was a special role in Israelite society. A kinsman redeemer had certain responsibilities toward family members who were in trouble. He could buy back land that a relative had to sell due to poverty. He could pay off debts. He could even marry a widow to provide her with security and give her dead husband an heir. This was part of God's system for taking care of families and preventing people from falling into permanent poverty. Boaz, as a close relative of Elimelech, had the right and potentially the responsibility to help Naomi and Ruth. Ruth told Naomi more about what Boaz had said to her. Ruth chapter 2 verse 21 records her words. "He also said to me, 'You shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" Boaz hadn't just been kind for one day. He had invited Ruth to keep coming back to his fields until the entire harvest was finished. This meant weeks of provision, weeks of protection, weeks of abundant gathering. Naomi immediately saw the wisdom and importance of this invitation. Ruth, chapter 2, verse 22, captures her response. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that people do not meet you in any other field." Naomi told Ruth to definitely take Boaz up on his offer. She should stay in his fields and work alongside his female servants. This would keep her safe from any danger she might face in other fields, where the owner might not be as kind or protective. So that's exactly what Ruth did. Ruth chapter 2 verse 23 tells us, "So she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law." Ruth kept working in Boaz's fields day after day. The barley harvest lasted for several weeks, and then the wheat harvest followed. For all that time, Ruth faithfully gathered grain, brought it home to Naomi, and the two women had plenty to eat. They lived together, and for the first time since losing their husbands, they had security and hope. The harvest season was coming to an end. Ruth and Naomi had enough food stored up, But Naomi was thinking about the future. What would happen when the harvest was over? How would they survive? More than that, Naomi began to think about Ruth's future. This young woman had given up everything for her. Didn't Ruth deserve a real home, a husband, security for the rest of her life? An idea started forming in Naomi's mind, and she decided to act on it. Ruth, chapter 3, verse 1, records what Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" Naomi's concern was for Ruth's well-being. She wanted to find rest and security for her daughter-in-law. The word for security here is the same word Naomi had used back on the road from Moab, when she blessed Ruth and Orpah, hoping they would find rest in new husbands' homes. Now Naomi was going to try to make that blessing come true for Ruth. Naomi continued in Ruth, chapter 3, verse 2. "Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." Naomi reminded Ruth of their connection to Boaz. Then she told her something important. That very night, Boaz would be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. Winnowing was the process of separating the grain from the chaff by tossing it into the air so the wind would blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back down. This was usually done in the evening when the breeze was best. The threshing floor was a flat, open area outside the city where this work took place. Then Naomi gave Ruth specific instructions. Ruth, chapter 3, verse 3, records what she said. "Therefore wash yourself and anoint yourself, put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." Naomi told Ruth to clean up, put on perfume, wear her best clothes, and go to the threshing floor. But she shouldn't let Boaz know she was there until after he had finished his meal. This was important timing. Naomi's instructions continued in Ruth chapter 3, verse 4. "Then it shall be when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do." This was the heart of Naomi's plan. After Boaz ate and drank and lay down to sleep, which was common practice for workers who guarded the grain overnight, Ruth was supposed to quietly approach him, uncover his feet, and lie down at his feet. Then she should wait for Boaz to tell her what to do next. This plan might sound strange to us today, but in that culture, what Naomi was telling Ruth to do was a symbolic act. By uncovering Boaz's feet and lying at them, Ruth would be putting herself in a humble, vulnerable position. She would be essentially asking Boaz to spread his covering over her, which was a way of asking for marriage and protection. It was a bold move, but it was also done in a way that put the decision completely in Boaz's hands. He would understand what she was asking, and he could respond however he chose. Ruth trusted Naomi completely. Ruth, chapter 3, verse 5, records her response, and she said to her, "All that you say to me, I will do." Ruth didn't question the plan or express doubts. She simply agreed to do everything Naomi had instructed. This showed Ruth's continued loyalty and trust in her mother-in-law's wisdom and guidance. So Ruth did exactly as Naomi had told her. Ruth chapter 3 verse 6 tells us, "So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law instructed her." Ruth made her way to the threshing floor that evening, dressed in her best clothes, and watched from a distance as the events unfolded. She waited patiently for the right moment. Ruth chapter 3 verse 7 describes what happened. "And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down." Boaz finished his meal and his wine. He was in good spirits, satisfied after a productive day. He went to sleep at the edge of the grain pile, probably to guard it through the night. Once he was asleep, Ruth quietly approached, carefully uncovered his feet, and lay down there in the darkness. Time passed. Then, in the middle of the night, Something woke Boaz up. Maybe it was the cold on his feet. Maybe it was just a sense that something was different. Ruth chapter 3 verse 8 tells us what happened. Now it happened at midnight that the man was startled and turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. Boaz woke with a start. He turned over and realized that someone was lying at his feet. In the darkness, he could see it was a woman, but he couldn't tell who it was. Boaz asked the obvious question. Ruth chapter 3 verse 9 records his words. And he said, "Who are you?" He needed to know who this woman was and what she was doing there. Ruth's answer was clear and direct. So she answered, "I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative." Ruth identified herself and then made her request. She asked Boaz to spread his wing or his covering over her. This was the marriage proposal. She was asking him to take responsibility for her as her kinsman redeemer, to marry her and provide for her. Boaz's response was immediate and full of blessing. Ruth chapter 3 verse 10 captures his words. Then he said, "Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich." Boaz blessed Ruth in the name of the Lord. He praised her for her kindness. He pointed out that she could have pursued any young man, rich or poor, but instead she had come to him, an older man. This showed that Ruth wasn't just looking for any husband. She was honoring the family connection and the role of the kinsman redeemer. Boaz continued in Ruth chapter 3 verse 11, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." Boaz told Ruth not to be afraid. He promised to do everything she was asking. Then he gave the reason why he felt this way. Everyone in Bethlehem knew that Ruth was a woman of noble character. Her reputation was spotless. Her virtue was recognized by the whole community. This wasn't just about fulfilling a legal obligation. Boaz clearly had respect and affection for Ruth, but then Boaz had to address a complication. Ruth chapter 3 verse 12 records what he said next. "Now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I." There was a problem. Yes, Boaz was a kinsman redeemer. But there was another man who was an even closer relative than Boaz. According to the law, that man had the first right to redeem. He had to be given the opportunity to fulfill the role before Boaz could step in. Boaz laid out the plan in Ruth chapter 3 verse 13. "Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be, that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." Boaz told Ruth to stay there for the rest of the night. In the morning, he would deal with this other relative. If that man wanted to fulfill his duty as redeemer, fine. But if he refused, then Boaz swore by the living Lord that he would redeem Ruth himself. He made an oath before God. He promised. So Ruth lay at his feet until morning. Ruth chapter 3 verse 14 tells us what happened next. "So she lay at his feet until morning, and she arose before one could recognize another. Then he said, 'Do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor.' Ruth stayed there through the night, but she got up very early before dawn, when it was still too dark for people to see clearly. Boaz was protecting Ruth's reputation. He didn't want anyone to know that a woman had been at the threshing floor with him at night, even though nothing improper had happened. He wanted to make sure no one could gossip or speak badly about Ruth. Before Ruth left, Boaz did one more thing. Ruth chapter 3 verse 15 records it. "Also he said, 'Bring the shawl that is on you and hold it.' And when she held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city." Boaz told Ruth to hold out her shawl or cloak. Then he poured 6 measures of barley into it. This was a substantial amount of grain, a generous gift that Ruth could take home to Naomi. It was both practical provision and a sign of Boaz's commitment and favor. Ruth returned to Naomi, carrying this heavy load of grain. Ruth chapter 3 verse 16 tells us what happened when she arrived. So when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "Is that you, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her. Naomi asked, "Is that you?" Perhaps it was still early and dim, or perhaps she was asking, "How did it go?" Ruth proceeded to tell Naomi everything that had happened at the threshing floor. Ruth explained about the grain as well. Ruth chapter 3 verse 17 records her words. And she said, "These 6 ephahs of barley he gave me, for he said to me, 'Do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" Boaz hadn't wanted Ruth to return to Naomi without a gift. He had sent this grain specifically so Ruth wouldn't come back empty-handed. This showed his thoughtfulness not just toward Ruth but toward Naomi as well. Naomi's response showed her wisdom and experience. Ruth chapter 3 verse 18 tells us what she said. Then she said, "Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day." Naomi told Ruth to sit tight and wait. She knew Boaz well enough to know that he wouldn't delay. He would settle this issue today. He would go immediately to deal with the other relative and finalize everything. All Ruth and Naomi could do now was wait and see how it would all work out. True to Naomi's prediction, Boaz wasted no time. He got up early and went straight to the city gate. This wasn't just any location. The city gate was where all official business happened in ancient Israel. It was the courthouse, the town hall, and the community gathering place all rolled into one. If you wanted to make a legal transaction, settle a dispute, or conduct any important public business, you did it at the city gate with witnesses present. Ruth, chapter 4 verse 1 tells us exactly what Boaz did. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Come aside, friend, sit down here." So he came aside and sat down. Boaz positioned himself at the gate and waited. And wouldn't you know it, the very man he needed to talk to walked right by. This wasn't scheduled, it wasn't planned. The man just happened to pass by at that exact moment. Once again, we see God's hand arranging circumstances perfectly. Boaz called out to him, using a term that could be translated as friend or so-and-so. The man came over and sat down, but Boaz didn't start the conversation immediately. He needed witnesses for what was about to happen. Ruth chapter 4 verse 2 describes what he did next. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Boaz gathered 10 elders, respected leaders of the community, and asked them to sit down as well. 10 was the number required for official legal proceedings in Israel. These men would serve as witnesses to whatever transaction was about to take place. Everything would be done properly, legally, and publicly. Once everyone was seated and ready, Boaz began to speak. He addressed the close relative directly. Ruth, chapter 4, verse 3, records his opening words. Then he said to the close relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech." Boaz presented the situation clearly. Naomi had returned from Moab, and she was selling a piece of land that had belonged to her dead husband Elimelech. This was the family property, the inheritance that should stay within the family line. Boaz continued in Ruth chapter 4, verse 4. "And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you." Boaz was following proper procedure. He was giving this man, who was a closer relative than himself, the first opportunity to redeem the land. If this man wanted to buy back Elimelech's property and keep it in the family, he had the right to do so. But if he didn't want to, then Boaz was next in line. The man needed to make a decision right there in front of all these witnesses. The relative's response seemed positive at first. Ruth chapter 4 verse 4 ends with his answer, and he said, "I will redeem it." The man agreed. He was willing to buy back the land. This must have been a tense moment. If this man redeemed the property, then the story would end differently. Ruth would not marry Boaz. The family line would go in another direction, but Boaz wasn't finished explaining the full situation. Ruth chapter 4 verse 5 records what Boaz said next. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance." Here was the crucial information. Buying the land wasn't the complete picture. The man would also be taking responsibility for Ruth, the widow of Mahlon, Elimelech's son. And more than that, any son born from this arrangement would carry the dead man's name and inherit the property. The Redeemer wouldn't just be buying land for himself. He would be buying it for the sake of a dead man's heir who didn't even exist yet. This changed everything. The close relative immediately reconsidered. Ruth chapter 4 verse 6 captures his response. And the close relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." The man did the math in his head. If he bought the land and married Ruth, any son she bore would inherit that land, not his own children. He would be spending his money to buy property that would end up going to someone else's heir. This could mess up his own family's inheritance and complicate things for his existing children. He couldn't do it. He refused the redemption and told Boaz to take his place. Now there was a specific custom in Israel for transferring rights like this. Ruth chapter 4 verse 7 explains it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. Taking off your sandal and giving it to the other person was the legal way to confirm that you were giving up your right to something. It was like signing a contract today. Ruth chapter 4 verse 8 tells us what happened. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself." So he took off his sandal. The man removed his sandal, the symbolic act that officially transferred his redemption rights to Boaz. In front of all the elders and witnesses gathered at the gate, this transaction was now legally binding. The closer relative had refused his right, and Boaz was now free to step in as the Redeemer. With the sandal removed and the right transferred, Boaz made his formal declaration. This was the moment everything became official. Ruth chapter 4 verse 9 records his words to the witnesses. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi." Boaz announced clearly that he was purchasing all the property that had belonged to Elimelech and his two sons. He was redeeming everything from Naomi. The land would stay in the family line. The inheritance would be preserved. But Boaz didn't stop there. Ruth chapter 4 verse 10 contains the most important part of his declaration. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. Boaz stated clearly that he was also taking Ruth as his wife. This wasn't just about buying land. This was about continuing the family line, making sure that the names of these dead men would not be forgotten, that their place in the community would be maintained through their heir. and he called on everyone present to witness this commitment. The response from the witnesses was immediate and enthusiastic. Ruth chapter 4 verse 11 begins with their statement, "And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, 'We are witnesses.'" Everyone agreed to serve as witnesses to this transaction. But they didn't just acknowledge what had happened. They also spoke blessings over Boaz and Ruth. The rest of Ruth chapter 4 verse 11 records their words, "The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem." These weren't empty words. The people were asking God to make Ruth like Rachel and Leah, the two wives of Jacob who had built the nation of Israel through their children. They were praying that Ruth, though a foreigner, would become a mother who would build up the house of Israel, just like these famous matriarchs had done. They blessed Boaz with prosperity in Ephrathah, which was another name for the area around Bethlehem, and prayed that he would become famous in his hometown. The witnesses continued their blessing in Ruth chapter 4 verse 12. "May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give to you from this young woman." Now this is fascinating. They mentioned Perez, who was the son of Judah and Tamar. If you know that story from Genesis, Tamar was also a woman who used unconventional means to secure her place in the family line when she had been wronged. And from her came Perez, through whom the line of Judah continued. The people were blessing Boaz and Ruth with the same kind of significant offspring, descendants who would matter in Israel's history. The legal proceedings were complete. The declarations had been made. The blessings had been spoken. Now it was time for Boaz to follow through on his commitment. Ruth chapter 4 verse 13 tells us simply and directly, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son." Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife officially and completely. And when they came together as husband and wife, God enabled Ruth to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. This detail about the Lord giving conception is important. Remember, Ruth had been married to Mahlon for about 10 years in Moab, and she had never gotten pregnant during that time. Now, with Boaz, God opened her womb. This wasn't just biology. This was divine intervention. God was at work in Ruth's life, bringing about his purposes through this child who was about to be born. The Lord was involved in this conception, making sure that this particular child would come into the world at this particular time through these particular parents. When the baby boy was born, the women of Bethlehem gathered around Naomi. They had seen her return to town bitter and empty, calling herself Mara instead of Naomi. They had watched her story unfold from tragedy to hope to fulfillment. Now, they celebrated with her. Ruth chapter 4 verse 14 records what they said. "Then the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel.'" The women blessed the Lord for providing this Redeemer. They weren't just talking about Boaz, though he certainly was the Redeemer who had made everything possible. They were talking about the baby, this grandson who would carry on the family name. They prayed that his name would become famous throughout Israel. And as we'll see, this prayer was answered beyond anything they could have imagined. The women continued speaking to Naomi in Ruth chapter 4, verse 15. "And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him." They recognized that this child would restore Naomi's life, giving her purpose and joy again. He would take care of her in her old age, providing the security that sons were supposed to provide in that culture. And then they said something remarkable about Ruth. They told Naomi that Ruth, who loved her so much, was better to her than 7 sons would have been. 7 was the number of completeness, of perfection. To say Ruth was better than 7 sons was to say she was worth more than any children Naomi could have had herself. Then something beautiful happened. Ruth chapter 4 verse 16 tells us, "Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him." Naomi took this baby and held him close to her heart. She became his nurse, his caretaker. The woman who had come back to Bethlehem feeling empty now had her arms full. The woman who said God had afflicted her now held God's blessing in her arms. This grandson brought her back to life. The women of the neighborhood gave the baby his name. Ruth chapter 4 verse 17 records this moment. Also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "There is a son born to Naomi," and they called his name Obed. They said a son had been born to Naomi, even though Ruth was the biological mother. In a sense, this child belonged to both women. He was Ruth's son by birth and Naomi's son by redemption. They named him Obed, which means servant or worshipper. This child would serve and worship the Lord, and he would serve his family by continuing their line. But the story doesn't end with Obed as a baby. The text continues with information that shows us why this whole story mattered so much in the bigger picture of God's plan. Ruth chapter 4 verse 17 concludes by telling us, "He is the father of Jesse, the father of David." Obed grew up and had a son named Jesse, and Jesse had a son named David. Not just any David, but King David, the greatest king in Israel's history, the man after God's own heart, the one through whose line the Messiah would eventually come. Do you see what happened here? Ruth, a Moabite woman, a foreigner who had no claim to Israel's promises, became the great-grandmother of King David. The woman who gleaned in the fields as a poor widow ended up in the royal lineage. The story that started with famine and death ended with her becoming part of the most important family tree in human history. The book closes with a genealogy that traces this line. Ruth chapter 4 verse 18 begins, "Now this is the genealogy of Perez." Remember how the witnesses had blessed Boaz and Ruth by comparing their house to the house of Perez. Now we see why that was so significant. The genealogy continues in Ruth chapter 4 verses 18 through 21. Perez begot Hezron, Hezron begot Ram, and Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. There it is, the line from Perez, through Boaz and Ruth, through Obed and Jesse, directly to David. This genealogy isn't just a list of names. It's showing us that God was working through every generation, through every person, through every choice and every circumstance to bring about his ultimate plan. And if you trace this line forward through the centuries, this same line eventually leads to Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the Messiah, the Savior of the world. Ruth's name appears in the genealogy of Jesus in the New Testament book of Matthew. A Moabite woman, a foreigner, a gleaner who showed loyalty and faith. She became part of the family tree that brought the Redeemer of all humanity into the world. The story of Ruth shows us that no one is too far from God's reach, no situation too broken for his redemption, and no act of faithfulness too small to matter in his grand design. Ruth's loyalty, Boaz's kindness, and God's perfect timing transformed tragedy into triumph and brought a Moabite widow into the lineage of Jesus Christ himself. If this story touched your heart and deepened your understanding of God's Word, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next biblical journey. Share this video with friends and family who need to hear how God can turn their emptiness into fullness, just as he did for Ruth and Naomi. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful biblical stories to life. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next video.